Deputies say it all happened on the 2100 block of Adams Avenue Thursday afternoon. That's where they found 41-year-old India Norwood Davis shot near her car. Now, loved ones telling me today this is a devastating loss and telling me how they're remembering her as more than a number. Tonight, as the Bibb Sheriff's Office investigates, family, friends, and former colleagues now remembering India Norwood Davis and her service to others.
As the investigation unfolded, something disturbing began to surface. Details that made this case ripple far beyond Middle Georgia, reaching national conversations from California to New York. The woman, named Darvis, had spent years working with at-risk youth, foster children, and teenagers navigating the justice system across Georgia and parts of Florida. She wasn't just a volunteer. She was a mentor, a safe place, the adult who answered late-night calls when kids felt like the world had already given up on them. And buried deep in court records and community whispers was a chilling possibility. The accused teenager may have crossed paths with programs connected to Angela's work. Not directly, not in a way prosecutors could prove, but close enough to haunt everyone involved. Imagine dedicating your life to saving kids from violence, only to be killed by one who grew up surrounded by it. That irony alone turned candlelight vigils into heated debates across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, with people asking whether compassion had finally reached its breaking point. Was this a tragic accident waiting to happen, or a warning sign America ignored for too long? It was an ordinary evening in Macon, Georgia, the kind that never makes the news. The sun had already dipped low over Middle Georgia, leaving the sky painted in dull oranges and fading blues. Porch lights blinked on one by one. Cars rolled slowly through familiar streets. Somewhere in the distance, a television played, and a dog barked once before going quiet again. Nothing about this night felt dangerous. Nothing about it felt historic. And that's exactly why what happened next shattered the city. Then came the sound that didn't belong. Sirens cut through the calm. First one, then several, racing through the streets of Bibb County, bouncing off brick buildings and quiet homes. Red and blue lights flooded an otherwise dark block, turning living rooms into flickering shadows. Neighbors stepped outside in slippers and hoodies, drawn by instinct more than curiosity. Yellow police tape followed, stretched tight across the street like a line no one could cross. Phones came out, whispers started, and within minutes, the unthinkable became real. Someone had been shot during a robbery, and the victim was not just anyone. She was a woman people recognized. Not a celebrity, not a politician, not someone who ever chased attention. She was known in classrooms, church halls, and community meetings across Macon and surrounding parts of Georgia as someone who gave her time to children most people had already given up on. She worked with kids who struggled.
Also, they worked through their trauma, but she was also that person that would celebrate with them when life went well.
Bishop says Davis, a mother herself, served as a mother figure.
Kids dealing with unstable homes, trouble at school, and paths that too often led toward courts instead of colleges. 4 years, she showed up where others didn't. And now, on this quiet Georgia street, she was gone. Police moved quickly, securing the area as investigators began their work. Officers spoke in low voices. Evidence markers appeared on the pavement. The woman was pronounced dead, and word spread fast. By the time official statements were released, people across central Georgia were already sharing the same stunned reaction. Why her? Of all people, of all nights, of all places. Here's the contradiction that stopped Macon in its tracks, one that still echoes across Georgia and beyond. The victim had spent years helping children, mentoring them, guiding them away from violence and bad decisions. Yet authorities confirmed she was killed during a robbery. A violent act. A moment of fear and choice. The kind of moment she spent her life trying to prevent. That irony hit harder than the crime itself. Neighbors described the scene as surreal. A place they walked every day suddenly felt unfamiliar. Some said they heard nothing until the sirens. Others said they sensed something was wrong before police arrived. Candles appeared along sidewalks. Messages were written in chalk. Parents held their children a little tighter that night, not just in Macon, but across Georgia, Florida, and other parts of the South, where stories like this feel uncomfortably close to home. And yet, at this point, so much was still unknown. Police did not immediately release all the details. They didn't explain exactly how the robbery unfolded.
Tonight, a West Macon neighborhood still dealing with the loss of India Davis. The Bibb Sheriff's Office is investigating after Davis was shot and killed Thursday. Investigators say a 15-year-old is now charged with felony murder and armed robbery. As the community grapples with the tragic loss, friends are remembering India Davis as a caregiver and an advocate for children. Maggie Fitzgerald is live on Adams Avenue. Maggie, what can you tell us about that shooting and about what India Davis meant to her community?
They didn't name the suspects. They didn't say how many people were involved. What they did confirm was simple and devastating. A woman who dedicated her life to helping young people had been killed, and the investigation was ongoing. This is where I want to pause and speak directly to you. Before we go any further, ask yourself this question and be honest about your answer. Can one bad decision erase a lifetime of good? Can a single moment of violence outweigh decades of compassion? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this case forces that question onto every parent, every teacher, every neighbor watching right now. As the night stretched on, police continued knocking on doors, collecting statements, piecing together a timeline from fragments of fear and memory. News crews arrived. Headlines began forming. And behind the scenes, investigators were already closing in on someone. What no one outside law enforcement knew yet, what would soon shock not just Macon, but people across the United States, was who police would say was responsible. Because when authorities finally stepped in front of microphones and revealed who they had arrested,
investigators say a 15-year-old is now charged with felony murder and armed robbery. As the community grapples with the tragic loss,
everything changed. And when police revealed who they arrested, everything changed. Before the crime scene tape, before the headlines, before her name was spoken in past tense, she lived a quiet life in central Georgia, the kind of life that rarely draws attention but leaves deep fingerprints on a community. Friends say she wasn't loud about her work. She didn't post about it for praise. In Macon and nearby towns across middle Georgia, people knew her as someone who showed up early, stayed late, and didn't walk away when things got complicated.
But she was also that person that would celebrate with them when life went well.
Bishop says Davis, a mother herself, served as a mother figure to many. He says he often saw her stand up for the children she served, and now another teen is charged with killing her.
The question I asked myself is, what might have been different had India and this young man had the opportunity to meet each other under different circumstances? What would the outcome have been? And I just hope and pray that it would have been very different. That I think India would have had the gift to potentially support this young man in ways that he might need in his life.
4 years, she worked closely with at-risk youth, children growing up in unstable homes, kids bouncing between relatives, foster placements, or struggling families stretched thin by poverty and stress. Her days were filled with meetings that never made the news, sitting across from teenagers who didn't trust adults, talking through school suspensions, helping families find resources, and reminding children that one bad chapter didn't have to define their whole story. In Bibb County, educators and community workers would later say she had a rare gift: she listened first. And for kids used to being ignored, that mattered more than anything. Her involvement with community programs wasn't limited to office hours. She volunteered beyond what her job required, attending neighborhood events, mentoring programs, and youth-focused initiatives aimed at keeping kids out of trouble and connected to support. According to people who worked alongside her in Macon and surrounding areas of Georgia, she believed prevention started with presence. If children saw the same adult show up again and again, maybe, just maybe, they believed the world hadn't given up on them. Colleagues would later paraphrase her mindset in interviews, saying she often reminded them that most kids aren't bad, they're just overwhelmed. That belief shaped everything she did. Families trusted her with stories they didn't share easily. Parents struggling to keep their children on track leaned on her guidance. And kids, especially teenagers labeled difficult, gravitated toward her because she didn't speak down to them. In a region where resources are often limited, consistency became her greatest strength. That consistency came with sacrifice. Those close to her say the work followed her home. Late-night calls, weekend check-ins, Emotional weight that didn't disappear when the workday ended. She chose a path that paid less, demanded more, and rarely offered visible rewards. But she stayed. While others moved away from Middle Georgia for better opportunities, she remained rooted in the community, believing change didn't happen overnight. It happened one child at a time. And that's what makes the contrast so hard to process. This wasn't someone living on the edge of danger. She didn't chase risky situations. She lived a routine life. Work, community, home, like so many people across Georgia, Florida, and the broader South who quietly hold their neighborhoods together. Her days were predictable. Her intentions were clear. There was nothing reckless about her choices, which is why the violence that ended her life feels so jarring, so out of place. People who knew her struggled to reconcile the image of the woman they loved with the way she died. Candlelight vigils popped up not just in Macon, but in nearby communities across central Georgia. As educators, parents, and former youth, she helped try to make sense of it. Some spoke about how she intervened at critical moments, redirecting a teen before a bad decision, offering guidance when no one else would. Others said she believed deeply that early support could stop violence before it ever started. And yet, despite all of that, despite years spent working to steer children away from harm, she became the victim of it. This is where the story grows heavier, because as investigators continued their work, the emerging details revealed a painful irony that would haunt the community. The person accused of killing her was not an outsider to the struggles she fought against. According to authorities, the suspect was a teenager, a minor, entangled in the same world of instability, poor choices, and access to violence that she spent her life trying to change. Let that sit for a moment. A woman who dedicated her life to protecting children, killed during a robbery, and the person accused of pulling the trigger was a child himself. Ironically, the person accused of killing her came from the very world she tried to protect. To understand how this tragedy could happen, you have to step back and look at the city itself. Not just Macon, but much of Middle Georgia, where deep pride and deep challenges exist side by side. This is a region rich in history and culture, where neighbors know each other and community ties still matter. But it's also a place where many families live one setback away from crisis. Public reporting over the years has shown that certain parts of Macon struggle with poverty, limited access to opportunity, and long-standing gaps in youth support, conditions that don't make headlines until something goes wrong. In these neighborhoods, young people often grow up fast. Schools do what they can, churches do what they can, nonprofits do what they can, but the needs often outweigh the resources. When families are stretched thin, supervision breaks down. When hope feels distant, risky choices start to feel normal. Law enforcement and community leaders in Georgia and across the South have repeatedly acknowledged a hard truth. Youth violence doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows quietly, shaped by environment, access, and desperation. One of the most dangerous factors is access to firearms. Publicly available court cases and police briefings across Georgia, Florida, and neighboring states show the same troubling pattern. Guns moving through communities faster than guidance or intervention. Teenagers, often legally too young to drive alone, end up holding weapons meant for adults. Not because they plan to kill, but because fear, status, and impulse collide in moments that spiral out of control. Authorities have long said that when a gun enters a robbery, the risk of death rises instantly, especially when the person holding it is young, scared, and untrained. This is why robberies so often involve juveniles, according to public crime trends. Not because teenagers are inherently violent, but because they are more likely to act impulsively, underestimate consequences, and overestimate control. A robbery can start as an idea, quick money, peer pressure, bravado, and turn deadly in seconds. Prosecutors and police across Middle Georgia have repeatedly stated that many juvenile-involved robberies are not carefully planned crimes, but chaotic encounters driven by panic and poor judgment. And it's important to say this clearly. Context is not an excuse. Understanding the environment does not erase responsibility. It doesn't bring back a life. It doesn't soften the impact on a family or a community. But without context, the story becomes too simple, and this case is anything but. The woman killed that night spent years trying to interrupt this exact cycle. Instability leading to bad decisions leading to irreversible outcomes. She believed early intervention could save lives, both the lives of victims and the lives of kids who might otherwise destroy their own futures. That belief now sits at the center of this case like an open wound. Because when the headlines broke, many people outside Macon asked the same question: how could this happen here? Those who live in Middle Georgia knew the answer was complicated. The warning signs had been there for years: overburdened systems, generational poverty, and too many young people growing up surrounded by risk with too few exits. This is where I want to stop and speak directly to you again. If this was your city, your street, your schools, your neighbors, what would you do differently? Would you invest earlier? Would you demand tougher enforcement, or more support, or both? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this case forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about prevention, accountability, and what society owes its children. All of that context matters, but none of it prepared Macon for what came next. Because on that quiet night in central Georgia, theory became reality. Trends became a real person, and the systems meant to prevent violence failed in the most final way possible. Then came the robbery, unplanned, chaotic, and irreversible. Then came the robbery, unplanned, chaotic, and irreversible. What happened next unfolded fast, and according to police, it unfolded without a clear plan. Investigators say the robbery took place at night on a street in Macon, Georgia, not far from where people normally walk, drive, and feel safe. It was not the middle of nowhere. It was a regular part of Bibb County, the kind of place where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen after sunset. The time mattered. Darkness gave cover. Fewer witnesses were outside, and fear had more room to grow. Based on information released by authorities, more than one young person was involved. Police would later confirm the presence of multiple youths at the scene. They did not describe a carefully planned operation. This was not a long setup or a drawn-out confrontation. Everything happened in a short window of time, measured in moments, not minutes. That's important because it explains why so much went wrong so quickly. According to investigators, the woman was approached during what police described as a robbery. There was confusion from the start. Voices overlapped. Movement was quick. Nothing about the encounter was calm or controlled. Law enforcement officials have said these kinds of crimes, especially when juveniles are involved, often fall apart almost immediately. Fear takes over. People panic. Decisions are made without thinking about the next 10 seconds, let alone the rest of their lives. Police have not said that the woman fought back. They have not said she ran. What they have made clear is that the situation escalated fast. In robberies involving young suspects, officers often explain that emotions spike suddenly. Someone gets scared. Someone feels trapped. Someone believes they are about to lose control of the situation. And in those moments, everything depends on what happens in a single second. That second came when a gun was fired. Authorities confirmed that shots were fired during the robbery. No graphic details were released. No unnecessary description. Just the fact that gunfire broke the night. Neighbors would later tell reporters they heard what sounded like popping noises, followed by silence, then sirens. The woman was struck and collapsed. The people involved did not stay. Police say the youths fled the scene, disappearing into the darkness of the neighborhood. In crimes like this, officers say there is often a moment after the gunshot where reality sets in. Panic replaces adrenaline. Plans vanish. Survival becomes the only thought. That appears to be what happened here. The robbery ended the moment the shot was fired. There was no victory, no gain worth mentioning. Just a person down and lives forever changed. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but it was already too late. The woman was pronounced dead. The street that had been quiet just minutes earlier was now filled with flashing lights, police tape, and stunned neighbors. What began as a robbery ended as a homicide. And that shift from theft to death is what turned this case into something much bigger than a local crime story in central Georgia. Police secured the area and began working through the night. Shell casings were documented. Witnesses were interviewed. Cameras from nearby homes and streets were checked. Investigators pieced together movements, timelines, and fragments of sound and sight. This was no longer about what was taken. It was about what was lost. And here's where the emotional contrast hits hardest. The woman who lay on that street was someone known for calm, known for patience, known for talking people down, not pushing them over the edge. The violence that ended her life stood in direct opposition to everything she represented. That contrast is what shook Macon to its core. People weren't just grieving a death. They were struggling to understand how this kind of chaos could collide with someone so grounded. As news spread through Georgia and beyond, questions followed fast. Why did it happen here? Why did it escalate? Why was there a gun at all? Police reminded the public that robberies involving juveniles often spiral because no one involved knows how to stop once fear takes control. There is no exit strategy, just impulse. Now let me pause here and ask you directly, because this matters. If you were walking down your own street tonight, do you believe this could happen there too? Or do you think your neighborhood is different? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this force us to face how close these moments really are. Investigators continued working behind the scenes, building a case piece by piece. What they uncovered next would change how this crime was viewed, not just by the public, but by seasoned officers who thought they had seen it all. Because what police discovered after the robbery shocked even veteran investigators. And that discovery would lead them to someone no one expected. The announcement came after hours of silence, when people in Macon, Georgia, were already glued to their phones, refreshing news pages and waiting for answers. Police stepped forward and confirmed they had made an arrest in the robbery that turned deadly. For a moment, there was relief. Someone had been taken into custody. The case was moving, but that relief lasted only seconds. Then authorities revealed the age of the suspect. He was 15 years old. That single number changed the entire conversation across Middle Georgia.
Investigators say a 15-year-old is now charged with felony murder and armed robbery.
A teenager. A minor, someone who, by law, was still considered a child. Yet police confirmed he was being charged in connection with the woman's death, including a murder charge tied to the robbery. The shock didn't just ripple through Macon. It spread across Georgia and beyond because people understood what that meant. This was no longer just a robbery gone wrong. This was now a case that sat at the uneasy intersection of youth, violence, and adult consequences. Law enforcement explained that under Georgia law, juveniles can be charged with serious violent felonies, including murder. In cases involving firearms and death, age does not automatically shield a suspect from severe charges. That framework exists to address crimes where the outcome is irreversible. A life had been taken, and the law, as written, required accountability. Still, knowing the law didn't make the reality easier to accept. The reaction from the community was immediate and divided. Some people were angry, furious even. They spoke about the woman's life, her work, and the way she died. To them, the suspect's age did not matter. A gun was used. A person was killed. They believed justice demanded the strongest response possible. Others reacted with disbelief. They kept repeating the same words. 15 years old. Too young to vote. Too young to legally buy alcohol. Yet now facing a murder charge that could shape the rest of his life. Confusion sat in the middle of it all. Parents across central Georgia hugged their kids tighter that night. Teachers wondered how a teenager could end up in a situation like this. Community leaders tried to speak carefully, knowing every word could inflame tensions. Some asked where the adults were. Others asked how a teenager even got access to a gun. And many asked whether this tragedy was the result of one bad decision or years of failures piling up quietly in the background. Police did not release the suspect's name because of his age. They stuck to the facts. He was arrested. He was charged. The case would move through the legal system. That restraint did little to calm the storm. Online discussions exploded. Radio shows filled with callers. Churches held prayer meetings. In Macon, people weren't just talking about the crime. They were arguing about what justice should look like when the suspect is still a child. This is where the moral tension became impossible to ignore. On one side was a woman who spent her life helping young people, now gone forever. On the other was a teenager whose life had effectively split into before and after in a single night. Public officials reminded everyone that acknowledging a suspect's age does not minimize the harm done. At the same time, others pointed out that this case forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths about prevention, responsibility, and the long-term cost of violence involving youth. And this is where I want to ask you something directly. At 15, should the law see a child, or a killer, Is it possible for both to be true at the same time? Drop your answer in the comments, because this question sits at the heart of this case, and there is no easy answer. As more details came out through official statements, another fact began to sink in, one that added a bitter layer to an already painful story. People started asking what the robbery was actually for. What was taken? What was gained? Because if someone lost their life, surely there must have been something significant behind it. What investigators revealed next would leave many people stunned. Because when the facts became clearer, the community realized something devastatingly simple. The robbery wasn't worth much at all. And that realization would deepen the tragedy even further. As investigators continued releasing confirmed information, one detail hit the community harder than anyone expected. The robbery that ended a life produced little to nothing of value. Police did not describe any major items taken. There was no cash haul, no expensive reward, no outcome that could even begin to explain the loss that followed. What happened that night in Macon, Georgia was not driven by gain. It was driven by impulse, fear, and a decision that collapsed in seconds. That truth changed how people talked about the case. Because when a life is taken over almost nothing, the violence feels even more unbearable. The woman did not die protecting wealth or property. She died during a moment that should have ended with everyone walking away. Instead, it ended with sirens, police tape, and a city trying to understand how so much could be destroyed for so little. The senselessness became impossible to ignore. On one side of the scale was her life. Decades spent in central Georgia, working quietly, helping children navigate unstable homes, school struggles, and difficult choices. Years of showing up, listening, guiding, and believing that people could do better. Her impact wasn't measured in money. It was measured in trust, in second chances, in the belief that one caring adult could change a child's direction. On the other side of the scale was a single moment of violence, a robbery that gained almost nothing, a gun fired once, a life ended, futures shattered, hers, and the teenager now facing a murder charge. That contrast is what made this case feel so heavy. People kept asking the same question in different ways. How did we get here? How did a lifetime of service collide with a moment of fear so completely? In the days that followed, Macon went quiet in a different way. Candlelight vigils appeared near the place where she died and in spaces she once worked. Flowers lined sidewalks. Handwritten notes were taped to signs and fences. Some messages thanked her for believing in kids. Others apologized for the violence, for the failure, for a system that didn't protect her. Silence settled over crowds as people stood together, not knowing what else to do. Parents brought their children to these vigils. Teachers stood with former students. Community members who never met her came anyway because the story felt personal. In Middle Georgia, many people knew someone like her. Someone who tried to hold things together while everything else felt fragile. Losing her felt like losing a layer of protection no one realized they depended on. What made the grief even sharper was the timing. She was killed doing nothing unusual, nothing reckless, just living her life in the same city she had poured herself into for years. That reality fed anger, too, not just sadness. Anger that violence had become so normal. Anger that access to guns could turn fear into death so fast. Anger that a child now stood accused of murder, and another family was about to be torn apart by the legal system. And yet, amid all that emotion, officials kept reminding the public of something difficult but necessary. Grief does not decide outcomes. Anger does not write sentences. Mourning does not change charges. The case was now moving forward, away from vigils and flowers, and into courtrooms. Prosecutors prepared filings. Defense attorneys prepared responses. Judges reviewed procedures. The system that would handle this tragedy was not built to feel, it was built to apply the law as written. That realization created a new kind of tension. Many people wanted justice that felt fair emotionally. Others wanted accountability that felt firm. Some wanted mercy. Others wanted certainty. But the legal process does not bend to public grief. It moves slowly, carefully, and often in ways that frustrate everyone watching from the outside. And this is where the story shifts again. Because while the community was still mourning what was lost, the court system was preparing to decide what would happen next. What charges would stand. How the suspect would be treated under the law. And what consequences would follow a crime that gained almost nothing but cost everything? Let me ask you something before we move on. When a case like this reaches the courtroom, what should matter more, the pain everyone feels, or the rules that already exist? Put your thoughts in the comments, because this next part of the story forces us to face how justice actually works, not how we wish it did. The flowers would fade, the candles would burn out, the silence would lift, but the law was just getting started. But the court system doesn't run on emotion, it runs on law. In Georgia, the law does not automatically protect a minor from serious consequences when a violent crime is committed. Officials explained publicly that juveniles can be charged with murder if the act involves the death of another person, especially when a firearm is used. That's exactly what happened in Macon. The suspect, though only 15, was formally charged with murder in connection to the robbery that killed a woman who had spent her life helping children. Prosecutors said the charges were necessary because the outcome was irreversible, a life was lost, and the legal system needed to respond. Being charged as a juvenile with murder in Georgia carries consequences that can range from detention in a juvenile facility to, in extreme cases, transfer to an adult court, depending on age and circumstance. Authorities emphasize that the law is designed not to punish lightly when death occurs, but also to consider the age and background of the suspect. Public statements focused on the balance the system must maintain, accountability for a violent act, and recognition that a 15-year-old is still considered a child under many circumstances. The decision to press murder charges, police and prosecutors said, reflected the seriousness of the crime and the need to prevent further tragedies. They highlighted the evidence connecting the teen to the incident and the responsibility that comes with using a firearm in a violent act. Statements were careful to avoid speculation about motives, but underscored the idea that age does not erase accountability in Georgia law. The announcement divided the public immediately. In Macon, some residents argued that no matter the suspect's age, taking a life demanded the full force of the law. Elsewhere across Middle Georgia and into surrounding southern states, people debated whether a child could truly be treated like an adult in the legal system. Social media, local news call-ins, and community meetings filled with discussion about morality, responsibility, and justice. Some emphasized rehabilitation for juveniles, pointing to the potential for growth. Others demanded firm consequences, citing the victim's decades of service and the senselessness of her death. It was a legal battle playing out in public view. Officials explained clearly that juvenile law exists to balance protection of minors with public safety, but emotions ran high. People struggled to separate anger, grief, and fear from the legal framework. Some said the law felt too harsh. Others said it didn't go far enough. The debate stretched beyond Macon, sparking discussions in Atlanta, Savannah, and across Georgia, and even into other southern states, watching how the system would handle this tragic case. And while lawyers argued law, families were burying a woman they loved. The streets of Macon, Georgia, were quieter than usual, but the weight of grief was heavy and visible. By the next day, small memorials had begun to appear near the scene where she had been killed. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes filled the sidewalks. People left stuffed animals, cards, and messages of thanks for a woman whose life was quietly extraordinary. For many in the community, seeing the tributes was both comforting and heartbreaking. It reminded them of the woman they had known and the gap her absence had left in their lives. Community leaders released public statements emphasizing her dedication. Local school officials spoke about the difference she made in classrooms and in counseling sessions. Parents shared stories of children she had guided through difficult moments, children who might have fallen through the cracks without her. Every statement carried the same theme: a life spent helping others, cut short by an act that could have been prevented. The words were simple, but they resonated, painting a picture of someone whose impact stretched far beyond her immediate circle. Educators described how she had been a stabilizing presence for students navigating uncertainty, teaching lessons about trust, resilience, and choices. Parents talked about how she had stepped in when they couldn't, making phone calls, attending meetings, or simply listening when a child needed an adult to care. The ripple effect of her life was clear: generations of kids who had been helped, families who had been supported, and a community now questioning how something so tragic could happen in a place they thought was safe. Neighbors and volunteers gathered for informal vigils, sometimes in complete silence, sometimes reading out prayers and reflections. The local news captured the grief as it unfolded, showing familiar streets now lined with flowers and small memorials. The contrast between the quiet of the city and the magnitude of the loss was striking. It reminded everyone watching that violence is never contained, and even the most careful, devoted lives can be touched by it unexpectedly. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. Many in Macon tried to make sense of the tragedy, especially children who had trusted her guidance. Teachers held classroom discussions, counselors met with students, and parents tried to explain an event that defied easy explanation. How do you explain to a child that the adult who believed in them, who guided them, is gone? How do you answer the questions about fairness, justice, and safety in a world that suddenly feels less certain? Those questions echoed through neighborhoods, schools, and homes, and no single answer seemed sufficient. The emotional toll was not limited to grief alone. Anger, confusion, and frustration grew alongside sorrow. The same community that had once praised her dedication now struggled to process a reality where someone they knew and trusted had been violently taken. People debated online and in local gatherings about how such events could be prevented, how juvenile crime is handled, and how families and communities could better protect their own. The conversations were raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal, reflecting the complexity of a tragedy that touched everyone differently. And as the city grappled with these questions, as flowers faded and vigils continued, the reality of the legal process loomed in the background. Court dates were being set, arrests had been made, charges filed, and while the community mourned, the family of the teenager accused of the crime faced a different kind of nightmare. The courtroom in Macon, Georgia, was quiet but tense as the case moved forward. All eyes were on a single fact that weighed heavier than any argument. The suspect was just 15 years old. A teenager, legally still a child, yet facing one of the most serious charges possible under Georgia law, a charge that could change the course of his life forever. The stark reality created an uneasy mix of emotions in the community: shock, anger, sorrow, and even disbelief. The family of the teen remained largely out of the public eye, but authorities confirmed they were deeply affected. Parents and relatives were grappling with confusion, shame, and fear for their child's future. In public statements, officials stressed that while the accused was young, the law must take its course. The teen's age added complexity, but it did not erase the fact that a life had been lost or the pain inflicted on the victims, family, and the community. Outside the courtroom, reactions were divided. Some members of the public stayed silent, struggling to process the tragedy. Others voiced outrage, anger that someone so young could commit such a serious act. Conversations in Macon and across Georgia reflected both perspectives: the need for accountability and the recognition that a child was involved. Public sentiment highlighted the difficult balance between punishment and understanding, between law and compassion. Throughout the proceedings, officials emphasized a central truth: accountability and tragedy can coexist. The teen was responsible for actions that had irreversible consequences, yet his youth meant the system also had to consider his potential for growth. Statements from law enforcement and prosecutors reinforced that the law exists to address both elements: the human cost of crime and the necessity of holding someone accountable, even when the individual is still a minor. The courtroom atmosphere reflected this tension. Families, neighbors, and reporters watched closely, aware that every decision would resonate far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The case was more than legal paperwork. It was a public reckoning with questions about age, responsibility, and justice. It was impossible to separate the human tragedy from the legal framework, and no one inside or outside the courtroom could ignore the weight of both. And this is where the story stops being about one crime and becomes about all of us. The tragedy in Macon, Georgia, did more than shock a community. It forced people across the country to confront uncomfortable truths about youth violence and the consequences of easy access to firearms. Public reports and statements from law enforcement highlighted the broader issues behind the crime: teens committing acts of violence, guns in the wrong hands, and communities struggling to protect vulnerable young people before it's too late. Experts cited this case as a reminder that the consequences of a single moment can ripple far beyond the individuals directly involved. Across the South and other U.S. states, similar tragedies have played out. Teens caught up in robberies or impulsive confrontations have ended lives, just as occurred in Macon. News coverage repeatedly references how these cases share common factors: lack of supervision, systemic poverty, easy access to weapons, and insufficient early intervention. The patterns are public knowledge and have prompted conversations about the balance between punishment and prevention. The woman's death highlighted the limits of compassion in a violent society. No matter how many lives she touched, no matter how much good she had done, one act of violence erased all of it in an instant. Community leaders stressed that her work did not fail, but it also illustrated that even dedicated individuals cannot fully prevent the effects of systemic problems without broader support. Families, neighbors, and educators were left grappling with questions they could not answer alone. The public debate grew heated. Some argued that stricter laws and harsher sentences for juveniles were needed to prevent future tragedies. Others emphasized investing in prevention, programs for youth, access to mentorship, counseling, and education aimed at keeping kids out of high-risk situations. Both sides pointed to Macon as a stark example of what happens when systems fail to intervene early and effectively. At this point, it's worth asking directly, do we punish harder or prevent earlier? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this case forces us all to wrestle with what matters most: accountability, prevention, or both. As national attention lingered on the case, it became clear that the questions raised by Macon went far beyond Georgia. Policymakers, educators, and law enforcement agencies across the South and other regions reflected publicly on how to reduce youth involvement in violent crime. The case has become part of a larger conversation about what communities must do to protect children while holding perpetrators accountable. The court will decide guilt, but history will decide meaning. Even as the case moved through the legal system, the life she lived continued to leave a mark on Macon, Georgia, and the surrounding communities. Publicly reported details emphasized her years of service: mentoring children, supporting families, volunteering for community programs, and being a trusted presence for kids navigating unstable homes. The students, neighbors, and family she touched carried forward the lessons she had quietly instilled: trust, guidance, and the power of showing up when others walk away. Her legacy was real, measurable, and lasting, even as grief remained fresh. Despite the clarity of her impact, questions hung in the air. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Authorities and community members alike wrestled with the same difficult inquiries. What could have been done differently, and who, if anyone, had failed first? Public statements from law enforcement made clear that investigations focused on facts and accountability, but they could not answer the larger, more personal questions that families and neighbors carried. These questions, impossible to resolve fully, added to the emotional weight of the community's mourning. The reflection extended to the children she had helped. Parents reported that students were left confused, searching for understanding in the wake of her death. Teachers and counselors said explaining her absence to young people was nearly impossible, emphasizing the fragile balance between hope and fear that she had worked so hard to maintain. Public tributes and community discussions reinforced her role as a stabilizing figure, someone whose life had been defined by service, not by notoriety, and whose death revealed just how vulnerable even the most careful lives can be. In the quiet streets, the memorials remained. Candles flickered, flowers wilted slowly, and in the spaces where she had given guidance, her absence was palpable. Community members spoke in hushed tones, reflecting on her dedication, her consistency, and the countless small moments where she had made a difference that now felt even more precious. The tragedy had taken her physical presence, but the echoes of her work persisted in classrooms, homes, and neighborhoods across Middle Georgia. Even with the legal process ongoing, even with arrests and charges made, one truth lingered over the city: her life could not be restored, and no verdict could fully answer the larger questions that this event raised. Families and neighbors were left with the weight of what-ifs, and the unsettling reality that one night of violence had undone decades of good. And in the end, one belief remains dangerously unresolved. As we reach the end of the story, it's worth returning to the question we asked at the very start: can one bad decision erase a lifetime of good? In Macon, Georgia, we saw the answer unfold in the most heartbreaking way. A woman spent years helping children, building trust, and guiding families through struggles. And yet, one night, a single violent act ended her life and left a city trying to make sense of it. The contrast between her decades of care and the seconds of chaos that took her away is a reminder of how fragile life can be and how quickly choices can ripple beyond our control. Her humanity cannot be reduced to a headline or a news clip. She was a mentor, a volunteer, a friend, and a quiet hero in her community. Public statements and stories from families.
What would the outcome have been? And I just hope and pray that it would have been very different. That I think India would have had the gift to potentially support this young man in ways that he might need in his life.
And educators show how much she mattered. Kids she helped, families she supported, and colleagues who depended on her still feel her absence. And while the legal process will continue, her impact on the people she touched will never fade. That is the lasting truth that cannot be erased by any act of violence. Now, it's your turn to reflect. How would you have acted if you were in her shoes? What would you do if someone you cared for was suddenly taken by something senseless and preventable? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because sharing your perspective helps others learn and inspires conversations that can make a difference. Your voice matters here. We also want to hear from you in another way. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Welcome to the family. We hope you feel part of this community as we remember lives lost, lessons learned, and opportunities to make a difference. Your participation keeps these stories alive, not just as news, but as motivation to act, reflect, and protect. If this story touched you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story on this channel. Our next video will cover another case where a single decision changed everything, an opportunity to reflect, understand, and learn from lives impacted by choices, both good and bad. These stories are about more than crime. They are about human lives, fragile communities, and the power each of us has to make better decisions. Sharing your thoughts in the comments, subscribing to support this channel, and talking with your family and friends are small actions that can have a big impact. By engaging, you help spread awareness, compassion, and understanding to others who may face similar challenges in their own neighborhoods. And as this chapter closes, remember this. Even in the darkest moments, we can choose to honor those lost by learning from the tragedy, by speaking up, by helping, and by never forgetting the difference one life can make. Another story is coming soon. Make sure you're ready to watch, share, and reflect. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join the conversation. Your thoughts, your support, and your voice can help inspire others. The next story is coming, and it will remind us all that every decision matters.